Discussion on Aphra Behn's The Rover. These are the topics that shall be covered. Let us start our discussion with the political scenario of 17th century England. In 1642, there was the rise of the Puritans. Puritans were the religious community and they were basically the offshoot of Protestantism, but they were more orthodox. In 1642, there was the rise of the Puritans. In 1648, they came to power and Oliver Cromwell became the Lord Protector of England. In 1649, Charles I was assassinated. After the execution of this assassination of Charles I, Charles II was defeated by Cromwell at the Battle of Worcester on September 3, 1651, and he fled to France. In 1660, there was the restoration of monarchy. Charles II came back to England and became the king. And after restoration, there were significant changes in political scenario, obviously, but also in the theatrical paradigm as well. In between 1642 to 1660, this period was called Puritan Interregnum. In 1642, almost all the theatres of London were demolished by the Puritans because they thought that this theatre or theatrical performances would advocate immoral activities among the people before 1642 and after 1660, because in between 1642 to 1660 almost all the theatres were demolished and there was no theatrical performance apart from a few masks and closet dramas. So before 1642 the theatres were usually called as Elizabethan theatres. Those theatres were open roofed and quite affordable for the commoners. Theatre was relatively affordable for the wage workers before 1642. Both aristocrats and lower middle class audience attended those theatres. That Another significant issue was that women could not act on stage in Elizabethan theatre or before 1660. Before 1642, the themes were more restricted. Now, after 1660, there were significant changes in theatrical paradigm. Theatre became costly because theatres were rebuilt after the restoration, and those theatres were close roofed and luxurious, so quite unaffordable for the commoners. Those theatres were actually attended by the aristocrats because those theatres became costly. Women can act on stage after the restoration. Women was allowed to act on stage and Margaret Hughes was the first actress to act on stage. Theatre got more liberty ever than before. So this conservative themes were not the criteria anymore in the restoration period. So the portrayal of lecherousness, promiscuity were allowed in restoration theatre. One important thing is that in restoration period, aristocrats used to attend theatre not only because they were very much connoisseurs of art, but it became quite fashionable among the elites to visit theatres at least once a week. So let us talk about comedy of humors. Comedy of humors is relatable to Ben Jonson, and it came in Jacobean era. Ben Jonson popularized this dramatic genre in the late 16th century. The term humor is derived from Latin humor, which means liquid. It comes from the theory that human body is composed of four humors or liquids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. It was quite unbelievable at that point of time that everything, all our emotions come from brain. The cognitive faculty of our brain is solely responsible for our emotions, characteristics, and everything. It was believed that because of these bloody fluids, we have varied emotions and characteristics. So when these fluids, I mean blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, are properly balanced, one individual would become healthy in mind and would have healthy body. Imbalance of these bloody fluids or excess of fluid would ascribe different characteristics or different effects. uh, Blood, if someone has more blood within his body, that individual would become optimistic. Morpheme would make one individual excessively calm. Choler or black bile would make someone ill-tempered or angry. Black bile would make someone excessively melancholic. Comedies of Ben Jonson can be called as comedies of humor. Now let us talk about Restoration comedy. Restoration comedy is also known as comedy of manners. Restoration comedies are English plays and performed between 1660 and 1710, the Restoration period basically. Common themes were scandals, bawdy jokes, extramarital affairs, manners of aristocratic society. Now, comedy of manners is used as a synonym of Restoration comedy. One thing is important, that why theme circled around aristocratic society, because they become the audience. In Restoration theatre, those theatres were attended by elites. Ultimately, those elite societies, those elite people became the subjects of Restoration comedies. Now, comedy of manners, let us talk more about comedy of manners. In English theatre, the term comedy of manners, also known as anti sentimental comedy, describes a genre of realistic satirical comedy of the Restoration period that satirizes the manners and social conventions of greatly sophisticated artificial society. So, aberration of manners of people belonging to elite society would be the source of amusement. These are some of the famous comedy of manners. William Whitechover's The Country Wife, George Etherd's Man of Mode, William Congreve's The Way of the World, Aphra Behn's The Rover. Some of the features: it satirizes fashion, vanity, view on life, vices of a social class, particularly aristocratic social class. Plot often centers on a scandal. Amusements come from wit. Stock characters: a fop, hypocrite, schemer, fool, jealous husband, interfering old parents, and so on. Now let us talk about Aphra Behn. Aphra Behn, 1640 to 1689. She was born in London. Sorry, she was born in Kent, England. Was an English dramatist, fiction writer, and a poet who was the first English woman known to earn her living by writing. Actually, her life was not less than a fiction. Rising from obscurity, she came to the notice of Charles II, who employed her as a spy in Antwerp. Upon her return to London and a probable brief stay in Deptford's prison, she began writing for the stage. She wrote under the pastoral pseudonym Astrea. These are some of her plays: The Forced Marriage, The Rover Part 1, there is a Part 2 of The Rover, The Roundheads or The Good Old Cause, The City Heiress, The Emperor of the Moon, novels, The Fair Jilt, Agnes de Castro, The Force of Generous Love, Love Letters Between a Nobleman and His Sisters, and Oronoko. Oronoko is perhaps the most popular novel by Aphra Behn. The Rover. Let us talk about Rover now. Rover has a subtitle which is The Banished Cavaliers. The Rover is actually a revision of Thomas Killigrew's play Tommaso or the Wanderer. It has multiple plot lines. It is about a group of Englishmen and women in Naples at carnival time. So the Rover's subtitle is very important: The Banished Cavaliers. Cavaliers means the followers of Charles I. So these you have four English gentlemen, and out of these four English gentlemen, three are banished cavaliers. They were the followers of Charles I, and they fled from England and stayed in Naples. So you have Naples as the setting. These are some of the important characters: Belleville, Frederick, Blunt, Wilmore. These are four gentlemen. Belleville, Frederick, and Blunt, they are the banished cavaliers, and Wilmore is a naval officer. Florinda, Helena, Valeria, Angelica, Bianca, these are Don Antonio, Don Pedro, Moretta, Callis, Lucetta, Stefano, Filippo, Sancho. Now, this play starts with a prologue. Now, what is the prologue? A prologue, which comes from the Greek uh, word pro and logos, means before word, is an opening to a story that establishes the context and gives background details, often some earlier story that lies into the main one and other miscellaneous information. The prologue, which claims to be written by a person of quality, opens with the assertion that neither playgoers nor critics tend to give unknown playwrights a chance. Whenever a new playwright comes, he is being criticized by the established playwrights and critics. The narrator further comments that the established writers mocking a new work are often bores and plagiarists themselves. Significantly, at one point, Aphra Behn, the writer of the refers to herself as he. Now, why? Because if you think about Restoration theatre, if you think about Restoration society, there was the question of the acceptance of a female writer as well. So, this performer who was performing this prologue ends by rhetorically asking the playwright what he would say to the audience, to which the hypothetical playwright responds that the people come for their own sakes, to have a good laugh at wit and debauchery. These people, this audience, are for their own sakes, not only because they were connoisseurs of arts, but it was quite fashionable among themselves, and they would enjoy the play because this play is about debauchery, multiple affairs, lying, this sort of immoral activities. So these people are like this, so they would enjoy this uh, theme of this play. Let us have a discussion on the plot. Let me tell you, this plot is intensely complex because of its multiple plot lines. The first scene introduces two of the play's major female characters, Florinda and her younger sister Helena, along with their brother, nobleman Don Pedro, and a cousin, Valeria. Florinda wants to marry for love rather than for money, while Helena wants to experience love rather than go into a nunnery. Although Florinda is in love with Belleville, a poor English cavalier, her brother Don Pedro wants her to marry rich Don Antonio, his friend, whereas her father wants her to marry Don Vincentino, an elderly gentleman. Florinda, Helena, and Valeria sneak out to carnival in disguise. Let me tell you, in this carnival, everyone is wearing a mask or wizard. In the second scene, Belleville's friends Frederick and Blunt tease him for his devotion to Florinda as they look forward to the women they hope to seduce at carnival. They meet up with Wilmore, a naval captain and wandering freethinker, and remark on the passing prostitutes. Florinda, Helena, and Valeria enter disguised as gypsy fortune tellers, and Helena and Wilmore banter and flirt. Belleville, not recognizing Florinda in gypsy costume, is surprised when the gypsy tells him to meet Florinda later that night at the gate of Florinda's house. Blunt, one of the other Englishmen, is targeted by a prostitute named Lucetta and he leaves with her. Act 2. The English cavaliers discuss a poster advertising a famous courtesan named Angelica Bianca. Angelica charges 1,000 crowns a month for her company. The price is so high, the cavaliers exclaim, it's enough to pay for the company of a princess. They lament that they are all poor, Blunt returns, declaring he is in love, but he is clearly being duped. Don Pedro Don Antonio arrive separately to court Angelica. Though they are masked, Don Pedro recognizes his friend and his sister's fiancé. Despite his engagement to Florinda, Antonio wants to pay for Angelica's services. Don Pedro is angered because of the insult to his sister and because he also wants Angelica. He challenges Antonio to a duel. Wilmore tries to steal Angelica's picture and a fight breaks out. Angelica calls Wilmore to her chambers in the second scene. Rather than apologizing to her, he argues with her and tries to get her to lower her price. Angelica is charmed by his boldness and falls in love with him. She sleeps with him for nothing, and her servants complains Love is the ruin of all prostitutes. Act 3. Helena has fallen in love with Wilmore. Florinda is horrified at her sister's willfulness and lack of virtue. The Cavaliers enter, discussing Wilmore, and Helena eavesdrops. Wilmore joins them and brags about having paid Angelica without spending a single crown. Blunt leaves to meet Lucetta once again. Helena confronts Wilmore, who seems to forget Angelica as soon as a new woman enters his field of vision. She demands she never see Angelica again. Angelica enters and is dismayed by their exchange. Valeria flirts with Frederick, while Florinda, in disguise, tests Belleville's loyalty. Not recognizing her, he pays no attention to the stranger, and Florinda leaves him a jewel to show it was her. In scenes 2, 3, and 4, Lucetta and her pimp rob the amorous Blunt of everything but his underwear and live clothing. Blunt vows revenge on all womankind. Scene 5 finds Florinda waiting to meet Belleville, but Wilmore stumbles in drunkenly and attempts to rape her. Her cries alert both Belleville, who tries to fight with Wilmore, and her brother Pedro, ruining her escape. In Scene 6, Belleville rages at Wilmore, who refuses to fight him. Instead, Wilmore gets into a fight with Don Antonio below Angelica's rooms and wounds Don Antonio. Passerby believes Antonia has been murdered. Wilmore departs, and when a group of soldiers arrive, uh, Belleville is arrested for the assault. Act 4. With Don Antonio's arm wounded, he cannot fight his duel the next day. In Scene 1, he persuades Belleville to duel uh, in his place. Belleville despises Don Antonio but agrees, believing he will be fighting another rival for Florinda. Scene 2 finds Belleville disguised as Don Antonio, wearing a vizard or mask. He defeats Don Pedro in a duel. Florinda intercedes at this moment for her brother's life, and Belleville lays his sword at her feet. Don Pedro still believes the other duelist is Don Antonio. He is impressed and insists Florinda must marry the duelist at once. This would be the ideal for Belleville and Florinda, but Wilmore reveals Belleville and spoils the couple's good fortune. Angelica confronts Wilmore angrily about Helena, and Helena arrives disguised as a boy. She relates a story about a noble woman in love with Wilmore. Wilmore recognizes her and tries to teach her a lesson by abusing the fictional noblewoman. Angelica demands Wilmore never see this other woman again. When she suspects Wilmore will be unfaithful anyway, she vows revenge. In Scene 3, Florinda and Valeria escape in disguise, although they are pursued by Wilmore. Scenes 4 and 5 follow Florinda as she slips into Belleville's lodgings, a house where Blunt is recovering. She asks Blunt to shelter her, but instead he tries to rape her and invites Frederick to join him. She shows a ring to prove she is a noblewoman, and they lock her away. Act 5. In Act 5's single scene, Belleville, Don Pedro, and Wilmore insists Blunt open his door. They laugh at his misery. Blunt explains he has a lady in captive, and Belleville realizes it is Florinda but cannot say anything without giving her away. Don Pedro threatens his sister without realizing that it is actually his sister until Valerie arrives to divert him elsewhere. Florinda reveals herself, forgives everyone, and leaves with Belleville to be married. Frederick also marries Valeria. Wilmore stays behind. Angelica enters and threatens Wilmore with a pistol, saying he has broken her heart and destroyed her honor. Wilmore admits to Angelica that he is not capable of being faithful, and she resolves to shoot him despite her lingering affection. Don Antonio arrives and offers to shoot Wilmore for her, but she lets him leave, hoping he will suffer the same heartbreak she did. Don Pedro appears and challenges Don Antonio to another duel, since he failed to show up for the last one. Helena walks in and Wilmore tries to convince her to sleep with him once again. She holds firm and he agrees to marriage. Finally, they tell each other their names. Don Pedro reluctantly blesses both his sister's arrangements. Revelers arrive and dance as Helena and Wilmore discuss their trepidation about marriage. This play ends with an epilogue. Aphra Behn's brief epilogue uses a rhyming couplet to mock the audience and to decry those leaders who want to censor plays with scanting rules would the stage refine. She complains that modern theatre can be damaged by restrictive attitudes. She says people will complain that it's not as good as the plays of the past. However, she says no matter how ridiculous it is, the actors do not even portray half the fool that some of the people watching are. In fact, it was a humiliation to the audience, but the play's popularity would imply that the audience enjoyed the mockery. The Rover as a restoration comedy. Remember, we started off our discussion focusing on the political scenario of the Restoration period. So in 1642, it was the rise of the Puritans and all the theatres were demolished. In 1660, it was the restoration of monarchy. After Restoration, theatre got liberty, women could act on stage, theatre became less restrictive. After 1660, theatre became costly as well. Aristocrats used to attend the theatre only. Restoration comedies are plays written and performed between 1660 and 1710. Common themes were scandal, poverty, extramarital affairs, manners of aristocratic society that you can see in The Rover. The unsentimental comedies of John Dryden, William Wycherley, and George Etheredge reflected the atmosphere at court and celebrated with frankness an aristocratic macho lifestyle of unremitting sexual intrigue and conquest. Thus, sexual promiscuity, systematic frivolity, and unabashed materialism were evident characteristics of Restoration period. In Restoration comedies, emphasis was, in fact, laid on the taste and cultural refinement, with men from all sections of society striving to prove themselves as wits. Undoubtedly, The Rover is a typical Restoration comedy because if you look at the comedy, you can see that focus is on the elite society. Even though you have three banished cavaliers, but they also belong to the elite class, and their manners would become source of amusement. Multiple affairs, bawdy jokes, lying to women, this would become the source of amusements. And obviously, the focus is on wit. The setting. You need to look at the setting as well. The setting is the carnival, a space characterized by licentiousness and short-livedness. This heightens the spirit of carpe diem, meaning seize the day, and the flaunting of rules in true restoration style. You have stock characters in the Rover, like any restoration comedy. Bachelor aristocratic gallants. You can also find in Congreve's The Way of the World Mirabelle. Florinda and Helena, we have the stock figures of aristocratic virgins and witty heroine, respectively. Millamant you can have in The Way of the World. The image of the youthful dame getting repulsed by a rich, decrepit old man. It's a typical theme of restoration comedies. A country fop is there. Blunt is the country fop here. One famous example of country fop is Sir Fopling Flutter in Etheredge's The Man of Mort. Now let us discuss the title. Remember, The Rover has a subtitle, which is The Banished Cavaliers. The subtitle, The Banished Cavaliers, refers to the group of friends who support King Charles I as royalists during the Civil Wars 1642 to 1651 and are unwelcome in England in the time the play is set. Unable to return home, they amuse themselves in Naples, Italy. So the three banished cavaliers you have here, Frederick, Blunt, and Belleville. They are the banished cavaliers. So perhaps the subtitle is referring to these three Englishmen. To rove means both to travel aimlessly and to engage in sexual promiscuity, and terms carries a connotation of disreputable merriment. The rover of the title is Wilmore, an exiled English sea captain on the shore, lived to enjoy the carnival, who is inclined to enjoy sexual affairs with women without any commitment. Helena can be rover as well because Helena is subjected to join nunnery and she does not have much time to find a proper suitor to get married. So Helena is in venture to find a proper suitor for her, unless uh, otherwise she would have to join a nunnery. Love, marriage, courtships. The plot centers around love, courtship, and marriage. Most characters spend the entirety of the play either chasing after personal love interest or else orchestrating matrimonial arrangements for others. Florinda and Belleville's mutual efforts to be together, Helena's persistent pursuit of Wilmore, or Don Pedro's exhausting and ultimately futile efforts to set Florinda up with Don Antonio. These are all focusing on marriage. Each character pursues his or her respective ideal of romance and partnership. The ways in which the union between a man and woman, either in the informal sense of love or the formal bond of matrimony, was conceived of in the 17th century. When the Rover premiered in 1677, English society at large held a conception of marriage that emphasized an obligation of the part of the children to honor and obey parents with respect to potential partners. The Church of England positioned this obligation as a religious duty. So, marrying someone was a sort of religious duty during this restoration period. Let us talk about gender roles and female agency. Now, powerful female characters in Sisters Florinda and Helena, two noble women, are introduced in the first scene as confident and independent characters that know both what they want and how to get it. This sort of rebellious behavior is out of the ordinary for female characters in the 17th century theatre, according to Helen Burke. So, if you look at the opening scene, you would find these two powerful female characters, this Florinda and Helena, who are there to to claim their identities, to claim their love, defying their fathers or their brothers' wishes. But what is important here as well, you can find that there were two rape attempts on Florinda, and Florinda ultimately forgives them, which is not expected actually. Remember, this play is written by a woman, Aphra Behn. So, Aphra Behn is also showing that what was the position of women during this point of time. Women were subject of physical entertainment, physical intimacy, or something like that. To further distinguish her female characters, Bain writes regularly witty and bawdy lines for some of her chaste female characters, particularly Helena. Themes of female agency can also be seen in some female characters. Consider Lucetta, for example, who designs and executes a clever, albeit cruel plan to cheat Blunt out of his possessions. Like Helena, Lucetta knows what she wants. She knows how to get it, and most importantly, she actively pursues that which she desires. So Lucetta outweighs Blunt here. The men of the Rover, on the contrary, take more of a backseat. Consider Belleville, for example, who spends his time at the beginning of the play passively lamenting his predicament rather than striving for his love. These are the references. Thank you.